State and Revolution, Chapter 5, The Economic Base of the Withering Away of the State. A most detailed elucidation of this question is given by Marx in his Critique of the Gotha Program, Letter to Brock, May 15, 1875, printed only in 1891 in the New Zeit, 9-1, and in a special Russian edition. The polemical part of this remarkable work, consisting of a criticism of Lassalleanism, has, so to speak, overshadowed its positive part, namely, the analysis of the connection between the development of communism and the withering away of the state. Section 1. Formulation of the question by Marx. From a superficial comparison of the letter of Marx to Brock with Engels' letter to Bebel, analyzed above, it might appear that Marx was much more pro-state than Engels, and that the difference of opinion between the two writers on the questions of the state is very considerable. Engels suggests to Bebel that all the chatter about the state should be thrown overboard, that the word state should be eliminated from the program and replaced by community. Engels even declares that the commune was really no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, and Marx even speaks of the future state in communist society. That is, he is apparently recognizing the necessity of a state even under communism. But such a view would be fundamentally incorrect. A closer examination shows that Marx and Engels' views on the state and its withering away were completely identical, and that Marx's expression, quoted above, refers merely to this withering away of the state. It is clear that there can be no question of defining the exact moment of the future withering away, the more so as it must obviously be a rather lengthy process. The apparent difference between Marx and Engels is due to the different subjects they dealt with, the different aims they were pursuing. Engels set out to show Bebel, in a plain, bold, and broad outline, all the absurdity of the current superstitions concerning the state, shared to no small degree by Lassalle himself. Marx, on the other hand, only touches upon this question in passing, being interested mainly in another subject, the evolution of communist society. The whole theory of Marx is an application of the theory of evolution, in its most consistent, complete, and well-considered and fruitful form, to modern capitalism. It was natural for Marx to raise the question of applying this theory both to the coming collapse of capitalism and to the future evolution of future communism. On the basis of what data can the future evolution of future communism be considered? On the basis of the fact that it has its origin in capitalism, that it develops historically from capitalism, that it is the result of the action of a social force to which capitalism has given birth. There is no shadow of an attempt on Marx's part to conjure up a utopia, to make idle guesses about that which cannot be known. Marx treats the question of communism in the same way as a naturalist would treat the question of the evolution of, say, a new biological species, if he knew that such and such was its origin, and such the direction in which it changed. Marx, first of all, brushes aside the confusion the Gotha program brings into the question of the interrelation between state and society.
"Contemporary society is the capitalist society," he writes, "which exists in all civilized society, more or less free of medieval admixture, more or less modified by each country's historical development. In contrast with this, the contemporary state varies with every state boundary. It is different in the Prusso-German Empire from what it is in Switzerland, and different in England from what it is in the United States. The contemporary state is therefore a fiction. Nevertheless, in spite of the motley variety of their forms, the different states of the various civilized countries have all this in common. They are all based on modern bourgeois society, only a little more or less capitalistically developed. Consequently, they also have certain essential characteristics in common. In this sense, it is possible to speak of the contemporary state, in contrast to the future, when its present root, bourgeois society, will have perished. Then the question arises, what transformation will the state undergo in a communist society? In other words, what social functions analogous to the present functions of the state will then survive? This question can only be answered scientifically, and however many thousand times the word people is combined with the word state, we get not a flea jump closer to the problem.
Having thus ridiculed all talk about a people's state, Marx formulates the question and warns us, as it were, that to arrive at a scientific answer, one must rely only on firmly established scientific data. The first fact that has been established with complete exactness by the whole theory of evolution, by science as a whole, a fact which the utopians forgot, and which is forgotten by the present-day opportunists who are afraid of the socialist revolution, is that historically there must undoubtedly be a special stage or epoch of transition from capitalism to communism. Section 2. Transition from capitalism to communism.
Between capitalist and communist society,
Marx continues,
lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the former into the latter. To this also corresponds a political transition period, in which the state can be no other than the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat.
This conclusion Marx bases on an analysis of the role played by the proletariat in modern capitalist society, on the data concerning the evolution of this society, and on the irreconcilability of the opposing interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Earlier, the question was put thus: to attain its emancipation, the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeoisie, conquer political power, and establish its own revolutionary dictatorship. Now, the question is put somewhat differently. The transition from capitalist society developing towards communism, towards a communist society, is impossible without a political transition period, and the state in this period can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. What, then, is the relation of this dictatorship to democracy? We have seen that the Communist Manifesto simply places side by side the two ideas, the transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class and the establishment of democracy. On the basis of all that has been said above, one can define more exactly how democracy changes in the transition from capitalism to communism. In capitalist society, under the conditions most favorable to its development, we have more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always bound by the narrow framework of capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in reality, a democracy for the minority, only for the possessing classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains just about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. The modern wage slaves, owing to the conditions of capitalist exploitation, are so much crushed by want and poverty that democracy is nothing to them, politics is nothing to them, that, in the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participating in social and public life. The correctness of this statement is perhaps most clearly proved by Germany, just because in this state constitutional legality lasted and remained stable for a remarkably long time, for nearly half a century, and because social democracy in Germany during that time was able to achieve far more than in other countries in utilizing legality, and was able to organize into a political party a larger proportion of the working class than anywhere else in the world. What, then, is this largest proportion of politically conscious and active wage slaves that has so far been observed in capitalist society? 1 million members of the Social Democratic Party out of 15 million wage workers, 3 million organized in trade unions out of 15 million. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of a capitalist society. If we look more closely into the mechanism of capitalist democracy, everywhere, both in the petty, so-called petty details of suffrage, residential qualification, exclusion of women, etc., and in the technique of the representative institutions, in the actual obstacles to the right of assembly. Public buildings are not for beggars. In the purely capitalist organization of the daily press, etc., etc., on all sides we see restriction after restriction upon democracy. These restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor seem slight, especially in the eyes of one who has himself never known want and has never been in close contact with the oppressed classes in their mass life, and 9/10, if not 99/100ths of the bourgeois publicists and politicians are of this class, but in their sum total, these restrictions exclude and squeeze out the poor from politics and from an active share in democracy. Marx splendidly grasped this essence of capitalist democracy when, in analyzing the experience of the Commune, he said that the oppressed were allowed, once every few years, to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class should be in Parliament to represent and repress them. But from this capitalist democracy, inevitably narrow, subtly rejecting the poor, and therefore hypocritical and false to the core, progress does not march onward, simply, smoothly and directly, to greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us all believe. No, progress marches onward, that is, towards communism, through the dictatorship of the proletariat. It cannot do otherwise, for there is no one else and no other way to break the resistance of the capitalist exploiters. But the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of crushing the oppressors, cannot produce merely an expansion of democracy, together with an immense expansion of democracy which, for the first time, becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not a democracy for the rich folk. The dictatorship of the proletariat produces a series of restrictions of liberty in the case of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must crush them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be broken by force. It is clear that where there is suppression, there is also violence. There is no liberty. There is no democracy. Engels expressed this splendidly in his letter to Babel when he said, as the reader will remember, that as long as the proletariat still needs the state, it needs it not in the interest of freedom, but for the purpose of crushing its antagonists, and as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, then the state, as such, ceases to exist. Democracy for the vast majority of the people and suppression by force, that is, exclusion from democracy, of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the modification of democracy during the transition from capitalism to communism. Only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalist has been completely broken, when the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, that is, there is no difference between the members of society in their relation to the social means of production, only then the state ceases to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then a really full democracy, a democracy without any exceptions, will be possible and will be realized, and only then will democracy itself begin to wither away due to the simple fact that, freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to the observance of the elementary rules of social life that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all school books. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without compulsion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for the compulsion which is called the state. The expression, "the state withers away," is very well chosen, for it indicates both the gradual and the elemental nature of the process. Only habit can, and undoubtedly will, have such an effect. For we see around us millions of times how readily people get accustomed to observe the necessary rules of life in common, if there is no exploitation, if there is nothing that causes indignation, that calls forth protest and revolt, and has to be suppressed. Thus, in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, poor, false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will, for the first time, produce democracy for the people, for the majority, side by side with the necessary suppression of the minority, the exploiters. Communism alone is capable of giving a really complete democracy, and the more complete it is, the more quickly it will become unnecessary and wither away of itself. Naturally, for the successful discharge of such a task as the systematic suppression of the exploiting minority of the exploited majority, the greatest ferocity and savagery of suppression are required, seas of blood are required, through which mankind is marching in slavery, serfdom, and wage labor. Again, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of exploited. A special apparatus, special machinery for suppression, the state, is still necessary, but this is now a transitional state, no longer a state in the usual sense, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the wage slaves of yesterday is a matter comparatively so easy, simple, and natural that it will cost far less bloodshed than the suppression of the risings of slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and will cost mankind far less. This is compatible with the diffusion of democracy among such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for special machinery of suppression will begin to disappear. The exploiters are, naturally, unable to suppress the people without a most complex machinery for performing this task. But the people can suppress the exploiters even with very simple machinery, almost without any machinery, without any special apparatus, by the simple organization of the armed masses, such as the Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, as we may remark anticipating a little. Finally, only communism renders the state absolutely unnecessary, for there is no one to be suppressed, no one in the sense of a class, in the sense of a systematic struggle with a definite section of the population. We are not utopians, and we do not in the least deny the possibility and inevitability of excesses on the part of individual persons, nor the need to suppress such excesses, but, in the first place, no special machinery, no special apparatus of repression is needed for this. This will be done by the armed people itself, as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, parts a pair of combatants, or does not allow for women to be outraged. And secondly, we know that the fundamental social cause of excesses which consist in violating the rules of social life is the exploitation of the masses, their want and their poverty. With the removal of this chief cause, excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. We do not know how quickly and in what succession, but we know that they will wither away. With their withering away, the state will also wither away. Without going into utopias, Marx defined more fully what can now be defined regarding this future, namely, the difference between the lower and higher phases, degrees, stages of communist society. Section 3. First phase of communist society. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx goes into some detail to disprove the Lassallean idea of workers receiving under socialism the undiminished or full product of their labor. Marx shows that out of the whole of the social labor of society, it is necessary to deduct a reserve fund, a fund for the expansion of production, for the replacement of worn-out machinery, and so on. Then, also, out of the means of consumption must be deducted a fund for the expenses of management, for schools, hospitals, homes for the aged, and so on. Instead of the hazy, obscure general phrase of Lassalle's, the full product of his labor for the worker, Marx gives a sober estimate of exactly how a socialist society will have to manage its affairs. Marx undertakes a concrete analysis of the conditions of life of a society in which there is no capitalism, and says,
"What we are dealing with here, analyzing the program of the party, is not a communist society which has developed on its own foundations, but, on the contrary, one which is just emerging from capitalist society, and which, therefore, in all respects, economic, moral, and intellectual, still bears the birthmarks of the old society, from whose womb it sprung."
And it is this communist society, a society which has just come into the world out of the womb of capitalism, and which, in all respects, bears the stamp of the old society, that Marx terms the first, or lower phase of communist society. The means of production are no longer the private property of individuals. Means of production belong to the whole of society. Every member of society performing a certain part of socially necessary work receives a certificate from society to the effect that he has done such and such a quantity of work. According to this certificate, he receives from the public warehouses, where articles of consumption are stored, a corresponding quantity of products. Deducting that proportion of labor which goes to the public fund, every worker, therefore, receives from society as much as he has given it. equality seems to reign supreme. But when Lassalle, having in view such a social order, generally called socialism, but termed by Marx the first phase of communism, speaks of this as just distribution, and says that this is the equal right of each to an equal product of labor, Lassalle is mistaken, and Marx exposes his error. Equal right, says Marx, we indeed have here, but it is still a bourgeois right, which, like every right, presupposes inequality. Every right is an application of the same measure to different people who, in fact, are not the same and are not equal to one another. This is why equal right is merely a violation of equality and an injustice. In effect, every man having done as much social labor as every other receives an equal share of the social products, with the above-mentioned deductions. But different people are not alike. One is strong, another is weak. One is married, the other is not. One has more children, another has less, and so on.
With equal labor,
Marx concludes,
and therefore an equal share in the social consumption fund, one man in fact receives more than the other. One is richer than the other, and so forth. In order to avoid all these defects, rights, instead of being equal, must be unequal.
The first phase of communism, therefore, still cannot produce justice and equality. Differences, and unjust differences, in wealth will still exist, but the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible, because it will be impossible to seize as private property the means of production, the factories, machines, land, and so on. In tearing down Lassalle's petty bourgeois confused phrase about equality and justice in general, Marx shows the course of development of communist society, which is forced at first to destroy only the injustice that consists in the means of production having been seized by private individuals, and which is not capable of destroying at once the further injustice consisting in the distribution of the articles of consumption, according to work performed, and not according to need. Vulgar economists and bourgeois professors constantly reproach the socialists with forgetting the inequality of people and with dreaming of destroying this inequality. Such a reproach, as we see, only proves the extreme ignorance of the gentlemen propounding bourgeois ideology. Marx not only takes into account with the greatest accuracy the inevitable inequality of men, he also takes into account the fact that the mere conversion of the means of production into common property of the whole of society, socialism in the general accepted sense of the word, does not remove the defects of distribution and the inequality of bourgeois right, which continue to rule as long as the products are divided according to work performed.
But these defects,
Marx continues,
are unavoidable in the first phase of communist society when, after long travail, it first emerges from capitalist society. Justice can never rise superior to the economic conditions of society and the cultural development conditioned by them.
And so, in the first phase of communist society, generally called socialism, bourgeois right is not abolished in its entirety, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic transformation so far attained, that is, only in respect of the means of production. Bourgeois right recognizes them as the private property of separate individuals. Socialism converts them into common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, does bourgeois right disappear. However, it continues to exist as far as the other part is concerned. It remains in the capacity of regulator, determining factor, distributing the products and allotting labor among the members of society.
He who does not work shall not eat.
This socialist principle is already realized.
For an equal quantity of labor and equal quantity of products.
And this socialist principle is already realized. However, this is not yet communism, and this does not abolish bourgeois right, which gives to unequal individuals in return for an unequal amount of work an equal quantity of products. This is a defect, says Marx, but it is unavoidable during the first phase of communism, for if we are not to fall into utopianism, we cannot imagine that, having overthrown capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any standards of right. Indeed, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately lay the economic foundations for such a change, and there is no other standard yet than that of bourgeois right. To this extent, therefore, a form of state is still necessary, which, while maintaining public ownership of the means of production, would preserve the equality of labor and equality in the distribution of products. The state is withering away insofar as there are no longer any capitalists, any classes, and, consequently, no class can be suppressed. But the state has not yet altogether withered away, since there still remains the protection of bourgeois right, which sanctifies actual inequality. For the complete extinction of the state, complete communism is necessary. Section 4. Higher phase of communist society. Marx continues.
In a higher phase of communist society, when the enslaving subordination of individuals in the division of labor has disappeared, and with it also the antagonism between mental and physical labor, when labor has become not only a means of living, but itself the necessity of life, when, along with the all-round development of individuals, the productive forces too have grown, and all the springs of social wealth are flowing more freely. It is only at that stage that it will be possible to pass completely beyond the narrow horizon of bourgeois rights, and for society to inscribe on its banners, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs."
Only now can we appreciate the full correctness of Engels' remarks, in which he mercilessly ridiculed the absurdity of combining the words freedom and state. While the state exists, there is no freedom. When there is freedom, there will be no state. The economic basis for the complete withering away of the state is that high stage of development of communism when the antagonism between mental and physical labor disappears, that is to say, when one of the principal sources of modern social inequality disappears, a source, moreover, which it is impossible to remove immediately by the mere conversion of the means of production into public property, by the mere expropriation of the capitalists. This expropriation will make a gigantic development of the productive forces possible, and seeing how incredibly, even now, capitalism retards this development, how much progress could be made even on the basis of modern technique at the level it has reached, we have a right to say, with the fullest confidence, that the expropriation of the capitalists will inevitably result in a gigantic development of the productive forces of human society. But how rapidly this development will go forward, how soon it will reach the point of breaking away from the division of labor, of removing the antagonism between mental and physical labor, of transforming work into the first necessity of life, this we do not and cannot know. Consequently, we have a right to speak solely of the inevitable withering away of the state, emphasizing the protracted nature of this process and its dependence upon the rapidity of development of the higher phase of communism, leaving quite open the questions of lengths of time or the concrete forms of withering away, since material for the solution of such questions is not available. The state will be able to wither away completely when society has realized the rule, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That is, when people have become accustomed to observe the fundamental rules of social life, and their labor is so productive that they voluntarily work according to their ability. The narrow horizon of bourgeois rights, which compels one to calculate, with the hard-heartedness of a Shylock, whether he has not worked half an hour more than another, whether he is not getting less pay than another, this narrow horizon will then be left behind. There will be no need for any exact calculation by society of the quantity of products to be distributed to each of its members. Each will take freely according to his needs. From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare such a social order a pure utopia, and to sneer at the socialists for promising each the right to receive from society, without any control of the labor of the individual citizen, any quantity of truffles, automobiles, pianos, etc. Even now most bourgeois savants deliver themselves of such sneers, thereby displacing at once their ignorance and their self-seeking defense of capitalism. Ignorance, for it has never entered the head of any socialist to promise that the highest phase of communist will arrive, while the great socialists, in foreseeing its arrival, presupposed both a productivity of labor unlike the present, and a person not like the present man in the street, capable of spoiling without reflection, like the seminary students in Pomulovsky's book, the stores of social wealth, and of demanding the impossible. Until the higher phase of communism arrives, The socialists demand the strictest control by society and the state of the quantity of labor and the quantity of consumption. Only this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the control of the workers over the capitalists. It must be carried out not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers. Self-seeking defense of capitalism by the bourgeois ideologists consists in that they substitute disputes and discussions about the distant future for the essential imperative questions of present-day policy, the expropriation of capitalists, the conversion of all citizens into workers and employees of one huge syndicate, the whole state, and the complete subordination of the whole of the work of this syndicate to the really democratic state of the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies. In reality, when these bourgeois professors and Philistines talk of unreasonable utopias, of the demagogic promises of the Bolsheviks, of the impossibility of introducing socialism, it is the higher stage or phase of communism which they have in mind, and which no one has ever promised or even thought of introducing, for the very reason that, generally speaking, it cannot be introduced. And here we come to that question of the scientific difference between socialism and communism, upon which Engels touched in his above-quoted discussion on the incorrectness of the name Social Democrat. The political difference between the first or lower and the higher phase of communism will, in time, no doubt, be tremendous, but it would be ridiculous to emphasize it now under capitalism, and only perhaps some isolated anarchist could invest it with primary importance, if there are still some people among the anarchists who have learned nothing from the Plekhanov-like conversion of the Kropotkins, the Gravises, the Cornelisons, and other leading lights of anarchism to social chauvinism. But the scientific difference between socialism and communism is clear. What is generally called socialism was termed by Marx the first or lower phase of communist society. Insofar as the means of production have become public property, the word communism is also applicable here, providing we do not forget that it is not full communism. The great significance of Marx's elucidations consists in this, that here, too, he consistently applies materialist dialectics, the doctrine of evolution, looking upon communism as something which evolves out of capitalism, instead of artificial, elaborate, scholastic definitions and profitless disquisitions on the meaning of words, what socialism is, what communism is. Marx gives an analysis of what may be called stages in the economic ripeness of communism. In its first phase, or first stage, communism cannot as yet be economically ripe and entirely free of all tradition, and of all taint of capitalism. Hence, the interesting phenomenon of communism retaining in its first phase the narrow horizon of bourgeois rights. Bourgeois rights, with respect to distribution of articles of consumption, inevitably presupposes, of course, the existence of the bourgeois state, for rights are nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of rights. Consequently, for a certain time, not only bourgeois rights, but even the bourgeois state remains under communism, without the bourgeoisie. This may look like a paradox, or simply a dialectical puzzle for which Marxism is often blamed by people who would not make the least effort to study its extraordinarily profound content. But as a matter of fact, the old surviving in the new confronts us in life at every step, in nature as well as in society. Marx did not smuggle a scrap of bourgeois rights into communism of his own accord. He indicated what is economically and politically inevitable in a society issuing from the womb of capitalism. Democracy is of great importance for the working class in its struggle for freedom against the capitalists, but democracy is by no means a limit one may not overstep. It is only one of the stages in the course of development from feudalism to capitalism, and from capitalism to communism. Democracy means equality. The great significance of the struggle of the proletarian for equality, and the significance of equality as a slogan are apparent, if we correctly interpret it as meaning the abolition of classes. But democracy means only formal equality, immediately after the attainment of equality for all members of society in respect of the ownership of the means of production, that is, of equality of labor and equality of wages. There will inevitably arise before humanity the question of going further from formal equality to real equality, that is, to realizing the rule from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. by what stages, by means of what practical measures humanity will proceed to this higher aim, this we do not and cannot know, but it is important to realize how infinitely mendacious is the usual bourgeois presentation of socialism as something lifeless, petrified, fixed once and for all, whereas, in reality, it is only with socialism that there will commence a rapid, genuine, real mass advance, in which first the majority and then the whole of the population will take part. An advance in all domains of social and individual life. Democracy is a form of the state, one of its varieties. Consequently, like every state, it consists in organized, systematic application of force against human beings. This on the one hand. On the other hand, however, it signifies the formal recognition of the equality of all citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure and administration of the state. This, in turn, is connected with the fact that, at a certain stage in the development of democracy, it first rallies the proletariat as a revolutionary class against capitalism, and gives it an opportunity to crush, to smash to bits, to wipe off the face of the earth the bourgeois state machinery, even its republican variety, the standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy. Then it substitutes for all this a more democratic, but still a state machinery in the shape of armed masses of workers, which becomes transformed into universal participation of the people in the militia. Here quantity turns into quality. Such a degree of democracy is bound up with the abandonment of the framework of bourgeois society and the beginning of its socialist reconstruction. If everyone really takes part in the administration of the state, capitalism cannot retain its hold. In its turn, capitalism as it develops itself creates prerequisites for everyone to be able to really take part in the administration of the state. Among such prerequisites are universal literacy, already realized in most of the advanced capitalist countries, then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by the huge, complex, and socialized apparatus of the post office, the railways, the big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc., etc. With such economic prerequisites, it is perfectly possible, immediately, within 24 hours after the overthrow of the capitalists and bureaucrats, to replace them in the control of production and distribution, in the business of control of labor and products, by the armed workers, by the whole people in arms. The question of control and accounting must not be confused with the question of the scientifically educated staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on. These gentlemen work today, obeying the capitalists. They will work even better tomorrow, obeying the armed workers. Accounting and control, these are the chief things necessary for the organizing and correct functioning of the first phase of communist society. All citizens are here transformed into hired employees of the state, which is made up of the armed workers. All citizens become employees and workers of one national state syndicate. All that is required is that they should work equally, should regularly do their share of work, and should receive equal pay. The accounting and control necessary for this have been simplified by capitalism to the utmost, till they have become the extraordinarily simple operations of watching, recording, and issuing receipts, within the reach of anybody who can read and write, and knows the first 4 rules of arithmetic. The majority of the people begin everywhere to keep such accounts and maintain such control over the capitalists, now converted into employees, and over the intellectual gentry, who still retain capitalist habits. This control will really become universal, general, national, and there will be no way of getting away from it. There will be nowhere to go. The whole of society will have become one office and one factory, with equal work and equal pay. But this factory discipline, which the proletariat will extend to the whole of society after the defeat of the capitalists and the overthrow of the exploiters, is by no means our ideal, or our final aim. It is but a foothold necessary for the radical cleansing of society of all the hideousness and foulness of capitalist exploitation, in order to advance further. From the moment when all members of society, or even only the overwhelming majority, have learned how to govern the state themselves, have taken this business into their own hands, have established control over the insignificant minority of capitalists, over the gentry with capitalist leanings, and the workers thoroughly demoralized by capitalism, from this moment, the need for any government begins to disappear. The more complete the democracy, the nearer the moment when it begins to be unnecessary. The more democratic the state consisting of armed workers, which is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word, the more rapidly does every state begin to wither away. For when all have learned to manage, and independently are actually managing by themselves social production, keeping accounts, controlling the idlers, the gentlefolk, the swindlers, and similar guardians of capitalist traditions, then the escape from this national accounting and control will inevitably become so increasingly difficult, such a rare exception, and will probably be accompanied by such swift and severe punishment, for the armed workers are men of practical life, not sentimental intellectuals, and they will scarcely allow anyone to trifle with them, that very soon the necessity of observing the simple fundamental rules of everyday social life in common will have become a habit. The door will then be wide open for the transition from the first phase of communist society to its higher phase, and along with it, to the complete withering away of the state.